Welcome. My name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the library, which means that I get to look after all of the library's research fellows, which is, if you've been to our Fellows Findings talks before, a really fantastic program of people doing all sorts of absolutely interesting things with the library's collections. So it's great to have you here for another episode of our Fellows Talk series. If you have any questions of today's speaker, please use the chat feature and I will come back in a little while to ask those questions for you. Our presenter today is Dr. Adele Wessell. She is an Associate Professor of History at Southern Cross University, and she was also the library's Merewether Fellow for 2024. It was fabulous to have her on her sprints from regional New South Wales here in the Donald and Mfanwe Horn Room doing her research on the Richmond River. I especially have some very fond memories of unfolding some quite complicated maps of the river and its network. So it's great to have her here this morning to share in much more detail her work on the Richmond River. Thanks so much, Adele.
Thanks, Rachel. I hope it becomes obvious as I go through the debt that I owe to the State Library, not just for its immense collection, but the help of the staff and particularly Rachel as well for everything that I've received. I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Widjabul Wia-bal people of the Bundjalung Nation. The land and the waterways of the Richmond catchment are on the unceded territories of the people of the Bundjalung and Widjabul nations, and they continue to care for and speak for country. And that has been some inspiration. Today, I'm just going to concentrate on the sources from the library. I live in Lismore on the Wilsons River, called Mamoon in Widjabul Wia-bal language. The Wilsons is a tributary of the Richmond River, and until 1974, it was called the North Arm of the Richmond River. There are some historical collections here, and the river itself could also be seen as an archive. But any researcher who lives in regional New South Wales can also be disadvantaged by distance from the archives and the State Library collection, and from lots of other researchers. So spending time in the library was a joy in lots of different ways. And I haven't had so much time in the library since I did my PhD way back in the 90s. So it was great to be part of a community of scholars, to hear about everybody's great projects and to take an interest in each other's. This paper is part of a larger project on the history of the Richmond River. I'm going to start by locating the river so you have some idea of where it is, and then talk about the double meaning of sources that I've used in the title. Firstly, source as a document or record of evidence, and secondly, to refer to the source of the river, the place where the river begins its flow. It's the point from which runoff water starts accumulating into a flowing channel. The historical sources themselves shape and reflect the history of the river geographically and socially. By 1846, all the lands along the Richmond and Clarence rivers were occupied by squatters, and 90% of the Richmond River today is still privately owned. The project started with the idea that rivers connect people and place, livelihoods and recreation, culture and ecosystems over their course and time. In the northern rivers, they also express a sense of place. The rivers give the region its name. They've also defined its history and industries, shaped its culture and architects, provide food and floods. This map, created by Andrea Brochette, shows the catchment of the Richmond River and the major tributaries, cities and local government areas, so you have some idea of the whole river basin and where it's located. The Richmond River rises in the McPherson Range in the Border Ranges, straddling the border between New South Wales and Queensland. It flows southerly through Kyogle towards Casino. The Richmond below Casino flows in a southeasterly direction to Corrocky, where it's joined by the Wilsons River. Then the river flows in a generally northeasterly direction, entering the Pacific Ocean at Ballina. The catchment, and hence the larger project, comprises the Richmond River, North Creek, Wilsons River, Coopers Creek and Leicester Creek, Eden Creek west of Kyogle, Shannon Brook and Bongawalbun Creek in the south of the catchment. The main arm, the Richmond River, meanders about 170 kilometres. Wetlands, river estuary and floodplains are associated with the catchment. The river flows through Bundjalung and Widjabul Country in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. The catchment covers 6,850 square metres and has the largest floodplain on the New South Wales coast. Periodic flooding is probably what most people associate with the Richmond, particularly after the 2022 flood, which towns in the region, including Lismore, are still recovering from. And the State Library has a growing collection of Lismore in post-flood recovery. The flood in 2022 demonstrated the vulnerability of our local archives and at the same time the urgent need to understand the history of the river. One of the outcomes of the fellowship was directly related to the sources, not just a history of the river. I wanted to make accessible the diverse records of the river. The Mitchell Library collection on the Richmond River is vast and diverse. Understanding its holdings would contribute to local heritage, and in the case of the river in particular, would facilitate raising public awareness and hopefully support further research. So I just wanted to introduce that part of the project first. With the library at Southern Cross University, I've been developing an online open access repository of materials related to the river as a flood recovery project. This is a partnership between Southern Cross University and Richmond Riverkeeper, which was formed in 2022 to advocate on behalf of the river. Regional historical societies and community organisations hold records that document the unique stories and experiences of the Northern Rivers, but these are poorly resourced and fall outside national strategies for sustainability, digitisation or investment. Like other parts of regional Australia, they can also be subject to extreme weather events like fires and flood, or humidity, light conditions and so on, which they might not be protected from. The Richmond River Historical Society archives and museum have not been available to the public since 2022. And Lismore City Council has recently reclaimed the historic municipal building where they were housed for their own offices. The catchment covers 5 different local government areas whose historical records are generally not accessible. Responsibilities for the river and the catchment are divided between different organisations and levels of government and have so far eluded a comprehensive history that focuses on the relationship between people and the river or a plan to improve its health. So this all makes the library collection particularly important. While the river's been subject to lots of studies, there's no central repository for records, reports, surveys and historical material related to the river and its catchment. The relevant records in state archives are dispersed across multiple government levels and organisations, which frequently change their name. So governance has been cited as a barrier to improving river health. The Mitchell Library collection includes field notes and cartographic material created by surveyors, explorers and botanists, as well as the papers and records of settlers and government agencies that describe the river and their relationship to it, and some of the voices of First Nations people, including authors like Ruby Langford-Guinevere. Those sources offer insights about the river, aspirations, land practices, river ecology and health, and how these were expressed in physical and material ways that produce changes in the river and our relationship to it. The purpose of the Richmond River Open Access Repository is to create a set of digital resources that can be used to enrich knowledge and understanding of the river, facilitate and promote research, be accessible, and hopefully to improve contribute to research that would advance in efforts to improve river health. So promoting the records held in the Mitchell is part of the effort of the fellowship. Within First Nations communities, amongst my colleagues in science at SCU and in the findings of numerous inquiries and projects about flooding or the state of the river, it's clear that the problems of the Richmond River are well known, but these are not widely understood nor acted on. We have multiple inquiries that often say the same thing or revisit proposals that have so far been rejected. So before I go on to look at the source of the Richmond River, I just wanted to revisit two historical sources held by the State Library to make my point about the value of historical records to assist decision-making about the river. So you'll see from the table, lots of structural options have been investigated as solutions to the flood problem, and these have been rejected on the grounds of cost and or damaging or social or environmental impacts. Recommendations for soil conservation, restoring riparian zones, and reforestation have not been implemented systematically. A levy, even though it had been rejected, to protect the Lismore CBD, though, was eventually completed in 2005. And again, since 2022, we keep hearing about engineering solutions like dams, raising the levy, and so on. Our federal MP, Kevin Hogan, has just started a petition in July demanding that the federal Labor and state governments model a scenario that takes 1 to 2 metres off a flood in the Richmond catchment. So I don't think that Hogan has necessarily read the 1958 flood inquiry or understands how environmental and social history interact, except in economic terms. Gilbert White was talking about the levy effect in 1945. It creates a safe development paradox, generates a false sense of security, and so on. Water experts have a levy joke. There are two kinds of levies, those that have failed and those that will fail. Dams as well create the conditions for more development and increased water demand, but the local member and the Mayor of Lismore are fans. Yesterday, we went to a community forum promoted as a resilience initiative organised by the National Emergency Management Agency to look at 15 different options to vote on, all engineering solutions, from dams to levee upgrades and water diversions. We know the outcomes of deforestation, intensive agriculture, use of pesticides and herbicides, flood mitigation and drainage. But these are either not understood or the reasons for addressing them are rejected in favour of short-term reactions. Historical records clearly show awareness of the impact of land use on the catchment and a desire to make improvements in practices. The final Richmond River Valley Flood Mitigation Report in 1948 highlights the knowledge of the state of the catchment that early. While land use measures employed by landholders increased runoff and erosion, they said, the inquiry recognised that this was because they were continuing practices widely adopted since the early days of settlement. 70 years have passed since the Flood Mitigation Committee reports, and the problem of erosion giving rise to poor river health continues to this day. Water quality is profoundly affected by land use in the upper catchment, but much of the historic research concentrates on its river mouth. Most histories of the river start with the mouth in Ballina, Rous's journey and naming the river in 1828. Today, I want to flip the focus to the river and where it starts its journey towards the sea, using sources held by the Mitchell Library. Essentially, the source of a river is the furthest point from the river's mouth. As it flows, it gathers water from other sources and streams and rivers, which also have their own sources. The river system is made up of a river and all its tributaries and the surrounding land that drains into them. Devoid of towns and human structures, we can see the river differently and understand also why the region is called the Northern Rivers. This map by Rob Garbett exposes the large catchment area flowing into the Richmond River that regularly overflows into the floodplain. It makes clear that a whole of catchment approach is required and that what happens in the upper catchment is crucial to understand. Any historian has to make choices about how to structure or organise their work, and I did think at one stage about how I might write like a river, as James Scott suggests, but rejected the idea. I am attracted to the idea of writing a history that meanders and bends and goes off in different directions, but I have settled on writing some accounts of the way that the Richmond River materially and symbolically shapes life in the Northern Rivers and in turn is shaped by it, using different themes for different parts of the river as it moves from the mountains to the sea. I'm going to start with the source of the Richmond and the upper catchment. Starting with the mountains today provides an opportunity to talk about botany and exploration, moving to early European settlement in the upper catchment through the lens of two women who were part of squatting families, Mary Bundock and Anne Sherwood. Henry Rous was commissioned to find fertile lands suitable for settlement during a prolonged drought, and during this time named the river. In 1828, he described the lower Richmond River after travelling some 20 miles from the entrance. The banks low, covered with long grass and mangroves, having the appearance of being often flooded. The general outline of the neighbouring country appeared to be flat open forest on the western bank and a thick jungle to the eastward with fine timber. And as you ascend the river, the tea tree, mangrove and swamp oak give place to Moreton pines, cedar, yellowwood, palms and gum trees. The banks in general not exceeding 10 foot in height, rich alluvial mould as far as the eye could reach to the west-southwest. Many natives were seen and a few huts upward of 30 feet in length and 6 feet in height. Rous's map of the short voyage he took to around where Broadwater is now puts emphasis on navigation, which was a requirement of settlement. In the same year, though, Alan Cunningham set out from the penal settlement in Brisbane to explore the country south with Captain Hogan and Charles Fraser, who was a colonial botanist. Cunningham's rough sketch of a portion of the interior of New South Wales between Hunters River and Moreton Bay is bound by waterways. Cunningham was sowing peach seeds as he went, some quince seeds and acorns, imagining that he was going to contribute to feeding travellers in the future and naming peaks and places after friends and people that he thought should be famous or flattered. I always carry into the interior a small bag full of peach stones, he explained, and whenever I find a piece of good soil in the wilderness, I cause it to be dug up and drop in a few in the hope of providing a meal for some famished European or some hungry blackfellow. Not having any clue about what First Nations peoples were already eating, he took, for example, macadamia nuts on this journey and sent them to Kew, but with no idea that they were edible. In August 1828, they named McPherson Range to complement Major McPherson. Atop Mount Lindsay, what we now call Mount Barney, because the map was lost when Queensland and New South Wales borders were being surveyed, and they changed the names of some of the mountains that were given. They found a stream running southerly into the channel of a river seen by Captain Logan from the summit of this mountain, and according to Cunningham, from the direction of its course towards the sea at southeast is doubtless the Richmond of Captain Rous of HMS Rainbow. Cunningham was primarily a botanist exploring for grazing land, although he proclaimed, "I can blend discovery with botanical research tolerably well." His rough sketch describes the land around Woodenbong, Urbanville and Dairy Flat as fine open country seen by Captain Logan at the summit of Mount Lindsay. Logan's letter and journal also describe the country more fully in 1830 when he revisited the Richmond to find a path to Port Macquarie. Cunningham's other expeditions to the Liverpool Plains, for example, are much better known, and there's far less written about this trip and the river source. Muriel Danver Power's History of Cunningham, for example, written as a primary school text, notes an expedition to Mount Lindesay, but only has one line. All the party enjoyed the magnificent scenery in this district. The focus was on finding a gap in the Great Dividing Range. Cunningham wrote an article for the Journal of Royal Geographical Society of London on the progress of the interior discovery in New South Wales in 1832. This expedition is relegated to a footnote and no mention is made of the river. Whilst engaged at Moreton Bay, he said in the winter of 1828, I penetrated to the base of a range of mountains. The principal summit of that range was named at the time Mount Lindesay. From Mount Lindesay, or Jalgambunge, the name it already had, water moves downhill in a continuous flow, becoming a river as it grows. When it rains, the water moves quickly into local streams and rivers, downhill, finding its way to the ocean. The McPherson Range is part of the Great Dividing Range. On one side, there's more rainfall, steeper slopes, and the water moves more quickly. We are now more familiar with the land east of the Dividing Range, with Ballina and the coast. Its prominence as a port to ship out the products of the region and higher population density has attracted interest. But the water collecting in streams and rivers connects the mountains to its entrance in the Pacific Ocean. And so the history of the upper catchment, both geographically and socially, is in one way artificially fragmented. What becomes clearer from the sources is the intimate connections people had with their surroundings and with each other. Russell Hausfeld's map, which comes from his master's thesis in 1961, provides an indication of the headwaters and the settlements close by, including Woodinbong Station, where Hausfeld was manager, which is now the Mully Aboriginal community. The Githable people's native title rights and interests were recognised on the 29th of November 2007. The determination covered the rainforests of the eastern border ranges that had been protected after a major battle by conservation groups starting in the 70s, including and continued by Githable custodians. So you might not be able to see the map well, but Woodinbong marked 1 is, and the station marked 2 is so close to the McPherson Range. Mount Barney, which was where Logan did actually ascend, is marked 12. And of course, the mountains would have had their own significance to the Githable people. The Githable are custodians of an area that encompasses the towns of Kyogle, Woodinbong and Benalbo in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales and extending north and west to Killarney and Warwick in southeast Queensland. Their country encompasses the upper catchment, beyond the boundaries of the native title map I've included here. Nick McLean has described the Githable approaches to mapping culture not focused on grazing lands or navigability, but stories, sites and language in traditional forms, and that of mapping everyday cultural practices such as fishing places and hunting grounds. The living histories McLean describes dispute the artificial separation between past and present institutionalised in historical accounts. The knowledge of the Githable people, as with the actions of settlers and the government regulations and processes they were subject to, don't belong in some distant past, but are expressed in the present and the future of the Richmond River. Indigenous knowledge, colonisation and Aboriginal dispossession were all intimately bound together as European colonists remade the social and ecological landscape of the region. Stories of the river that are encompassed in the library collections largely focus on the context of a landholding and agricultural system, so the settlers themselves become a source of information about the river and the land use that impacted it. The river and ecology is still an agent in this history. It shaped where people settled, how they lived, and in turn, their cattle and horses made some of the first impacts on the river in the colonial period. From the outset, the Northern Rivers was intended for food production, and the value of timber, especially red cedar, attracted colonists to settle in the area from the 1840s. The big scrub and the absence of grasses for pasturing livestock in many parts of the Northern Rivers had created a barrier to earlier settlement. Giftable land was not part of the big scrub. Land on the upper catchment could support cattle, and the extensive leasehold properties in the district were largely confined to the open forested country to the west of the rainforest. Clement Hodgkinson's description of the Richmond River from his travels in 1841 puts an emphasis on productivity. Alluvial land higher up the river, diversified by brush, abounding in cedar and pine, small rich plains and lightly wooded forest flats of great richness. The rest of the country, he proclaimed, is very lightly wooded grassy forest of greatest fertility. In fact, there are few rivers where so much good available land exists, unbroken by densely wooded ranges and ravines. By the time surveyor James Burnett came to survey the Richmond River in 1843, the occupation of the Richmond was well advanced, supported a few years later by long-term leases to pastoralists over their holdings. John Murray's sketch of New England, Beardy Plains, the Clarence and Richmond Rivers from 1844 includes the names of runs on the Upper Richmond. The area marked Ogilvie had by this time already passed to the Bundocks and his Wyangaree, and I've shown it with an arrow at the top there. All the broken country that they describe is actually land that was heavily timbered. In 1845, 21 licences had been granted for pastoral runs in the Richmond Valley. Licences were introduced in 1837 to lease the land from the New South Wales government, plus a fee for the number and type of stock grazed on the land. The fee was introduced to finance the cost of border police and land commissioners. Land commissioners like Oliver Fry were supposed to limit conflict between squatters and Aboriginal people, enforce the Crown Land Act and eliminate illegal runs. Fry was Commissioner of Crown Lands in the Clarence from 1842 to 1856, but this included the Richmond and Tweed rivers, and he reported on Aboriginal communities in the region. Fry married the daughter of William Wilson, who had the Lismore run and whose papers are also held in the library. The squatters who arrived on the Richmond and Tweed in the 1840s and 50s heralded a violent and complex process of dispossession and accommodation with the Aboriginal owners. The large pastoral properties, with their sparse populations of newcomers, enabled some level of dual occupation between traditional owners and squatters in different pockets of the region. It is in that context that we can consider the papers of the Bundock family and Mary Bundock's memoirs and notes on the Richmond River Blacks. I do want to note some gratitude to Paula Byrne, who I met as another fellow last year, for tempering any great admiration for Mary Bundock. Paula described most of her histories as blurred concoctions, and I'm inclined to agree. She's right about Bundock being influential because most historians writing the history of the area go to the texts that she produced. I've largely focused on what they say about the river, not necessarily the Githable people, many of whom worked on the station but were not paid. Wellington Cochrane Bundock took up a licence on the run he named Wyangaree, and the library holds family papers and estate papers. His daughter Mary Bundock is best known for the extensive collection of Aboriginal artefacts donated to the Australian Museum in Sydney, as well as international museums. In her memoirs, Mary Bundock recounts the story her father told her of first going to Wyangaree. One afternoon, she said, he rode over the low gap which leads to the lovely Wyangaree Plain, north of Kyogle. He thought it the most beautiful spot he had ever seen, a smooth open plain with one clump of heavy timber and 2 or 3 small lagoons sparkling in the sun, with the river fringed by brushwood. Mary's brother, Charles Wyndham Bundock, suggests the work of clearing the land was actually much harder than that, and that more gratitude should have been paid to the families who reshaped the landscape. In those days, he recalled, in 1922, the country along the river was very coarse and rough and of little value. The finely grassed country of today was made by us pioneers who got no thanks for it and were very often abused. In 1922, I'm not really sure what that abuse amounted to. Ellen Bundock grew exotic shrubs, trees, vines, creepers, and flowers in Waiangere in the 1840s, but ever after regretted introducing water hyacinth, as this aquatic monster, which brooks no rival, soon took complete possession of the lagoon. The introduction of invasive species like water hyacinth impacted navigation and water flow as early as 1900 and required extensive chemical control. Mary Bundock described a childhood spent largely in the bush, never seeing any other children and playing very happily at games of our own invention, and as we grew old enough, riding about and fishing in the various creeks and the river. The family were completely dependent on the river for water, and like other settlers, built their homestead close to the river to draw water to the house, in fine weather doing their washing in the running water, which she says was much cleaner than the water that was running off the roof. Bundock described the rivers in her memoirs that she remembered from her childhood. The Upper Richmond was then a beautiful stream of clear water running over clean sand and pebbles, an ideal of beauty and purity not to be surpassed anywhere, with steeply shelving banks of either clean grass or shaded by beautiful trees of many kinds. Bundock also made notes on the Githable people's relationship with the river, who had, she said, a good deal of fish in the summer and large mussels from lagoons. They caught fish with lines all through the warm weather, and before Christmas, when the streams were low, they entered the shallow water and drove the shoals into nets fixed across the stream and at the lower end of a deep pool, where the water again shoaled. I have seen a 50-pound cod, she said, caught in this manner. The Richmond River cod, an eastern freshwater cod, is likely what Bundock is referring to. It is now extinct from overfishing and habitat destruction, like desnagging. Restocking efforts as well have been hindered because the river itself is broken and requires habitat, which is now the focus of projects like Ozfish. Unamgar is 20 miles from Waiangere. It's the closest homestead to Mount Lindsay, established on the Richmond River in 1846. It was the last run to be taken up on the Richmond. James Glennie took it up with his wife Susan, who was Mary Bundock's grandmother's sister, so her great auntie. It passed into the hands of Thomas Sherwood in 1864, who lived there with his wife Anne and their family. Anne Sherwood's diary was filmed as part of the Australian Joint Copying Project by the National Library and the State Library. It records a prosperous station, but the focus is on people coming and going and trips for supplies, what the weather was like, and not necessarily on the river on which their livelihoods would depend, and which could have provided some relief from the hot summers that she's describing in this diary entry. The Sherwood family photographs, acquired by the library in 2011, are more illuminating for showing an interaction with the river. These photographs, taken in 1869, include the family in the river, shown in the slide, with a clear easement to the river frontage, although it does look like it's fenced off, at least in that spot at the back. Erosion caused by cattle is one of the issues that was noted in the 1958 flood inquiry. The collection also includes Githable people by the river. Mount Lindsay, this is a photograph of Mount Lindsay from the station, was the Queensland Station Maroon's southern border and the northern border of Unamgar. Glennie, the first station owner, had cut a path from there to Maroon in Queensland when his daughter married James Collin in 1852. And a lot of the settlers were moving about actually in horse, and not necessarily like other parts of the catchment where people talk about the river as being the highway. In the 1980s, Thomas Murray Pryor acquired the station from his father, and Mary Bundock moved to Maroon Station when they married in 1902. Both the river and the mountain connected Wyangaree and Unamgar, as well as the families and their shared histories. In 1872, Anne Sherwood wrote a widely published account of Murray Pryor's ascent of Mount Lindesay, claiming him as the first European to climb the mountain. By this time, the names of the mountains had been changed. Logan had climbed Mount Barney, although a lot of people may have thought that he still climbed Mount Lindesay. This has been widely held as true, even though in 1902, Mary Murray Pryor claimed that it had been climbed in the 1840s. The squatters were connected with each other and closely acquainted with the environment, despite its clearance and transformation being the subject of some celebration. With the squatters, the Upper Richmond had a small European population, with the squatters and their workers living in what's been described as relative isolation on the squatting runs, but they weren't necessarily isolated from each other. Hausfeld stated that all whites, though widely separated in isolated groups throughout the area, regarded themselves as members of the one community. The breakup of the large squatting runs into the smaller farming blocks of 200 to 300 acres from the late 1800s resulted in more Bundjalung and Githable exclusion from their country and ushered in more environmental change. By 1870, the original 20 stations were reduced by amalgamation and halved. Closer settlement, driven by the Land Selection Acts of the 1860s and Crown Land Acts of the 1880s, came late to the Upper Richmond because of the terrain and the distance from Sydney. Land reform was closely associated with political discourse and the equation of private ownership with individual power. And the negative consequences of this asceticisation of land on the river is clear. The large Mitchell collection of subdivision maps reveal high aspirations for the area and shaped people's expectations of the Garden of Australia. Picturesque, well-watered, and always on the edge of great prosperity. Today, close to 90% of the river frontage is secured as private property, and access to the river is often dependent on landowners' consent. While other parts of the river could tell stories of shipping, of dairying, engineering solutions to flooding, and the containing of creeks that were parts of the river's natural drainage system into pipes and cement, the story of the Upper Richmond contained in the library's collection conveys something of proximity to the river and the connection of families, and the practices that they shared that were carried on by subsequent settlers. They tell us what the river was like before the impacts of land use they initiated caused such significant damage to the river's health. Going back to the sources, Anne Sherwood's diaries and Sherwood family collection and the Bundock family papers recall the river's agency and how it shaped their life and livelihoods. This also suggests that Alan Cunningham perhaps underestimated the significance of the source of the river. The large Richmond River floodplain is significantly affected by land use in the upper catchment, along with floodplain drainage and agriculture in the lower reaches. Limited riparian vegetation results in soil erosion after rainfall events and gives rise to high turbidity and runoff, and suspended sediments often carries nutrient loads and other pollutants from agricultural and urban runoff. Understanding land use in the upper catchment then from the sources of the river seems essential. Change is required that crosses government boundaries and takes into account those historical records. We stand at a juncture where the river is literally dying for us to act on what we already know. So I'm finished. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Adele. Yes, if you do have any questions, please use the little speech bubbles at the top of your screen. We do have a couple of things coming through already. And I have possibly an unfair question because it's probably just rhetorical, but I don't understand. You made several references to manuscript materials this morning where people are really genuine in their admiration for the beauty of the landscape. This is stunning, isn't this gorgeous? Blah, blah, blah. Quick, let's go and plant something weird from another place here and completely transform it. Like, I just don't understand why people do that. And then it's like, oh, oopsie, we've lost that lagoon. Let's plant something weird a little bit further along. Is that still happening today in the area?
Um, yeah, to some extent. I mean, I think that this was part of probably a much bigger movement where people were giving themselves a sense of home by introducing those things that they thought were, that were familiar to them and so on. There's all of the work, I guess, of the acclimatization societies that are really promoting the idea that colonies could be sharing all of these things, but not really understanding what the impact of them was going to be and the consequences of those. And sometimes, something is happening in one area without necessarily realizing that there's a connection between all of those rivers and creeks and that those things are going to flow and go on further as well. So, destroying habitat in one area, blowing it up for the railway, for example, which destroyed Richmond River cod habitat, wasn't understood to then, have an effect on their whole population.
Yes, complicated. And so difficult to reverse as you've been. I mean, certainly if the railways have been blowing stuff up, that is slightly more problematic than trying to clear out some water lilies. But yes.
I know. Well, they actually, in 1915, they had a water hyacinth, like a special regulatory department looking after it. It basically stopped all of the river trade,
Wow.
for quite some time. And there are photographs of just these infestations where the ships were just not able to continue moving through.
Another question that is possibly also a little bit tricky for you to answer. Um, the politics behind these engineering solutions for flood mitigation that you were talking about earlier, somebody's saying they were quite startled. And I have to admit, I too was very startled when you said that 90% of the river is in private ownership. And I think there's this sense that so much in Australia that is of an inherent public good is in public hands, but clearly not. And that's quite a frightening statistic. So the question is around how much of that private, very specific private interest is driving a hesitancy to adopt reasonable solutions or solutions that are actually going to work for the community.
Yeah, I mean it definitely becomes a barrier. Once you're on the river, like if you got into a canoe or a kayak on the river, the state owns that sort of uh, land initially on the river banks. So you can kind of go through parts of it and obviously have to pick it up and move across areas and so on. It becomes quite a challenge though. Um, there are some projects that have been initiated where people are working very closely with landowners to try and do things because a lot of there's no fencing, for example, on a lot of that area. So there's still erosion caused from cattle and livestock. There's, high levels of pesticide that constantly are coming up in reports and research, that's running into the river. There's a lot of silt and siltation that has kind of like just changed the the depth of the river and also its breadth. So there is an understanding and there's, some efforts, but it does become really difficult. And certainly concentrating on that land use in the upper catchment is recognised as being important. But the will has to be there to be able to do that as well. And people don't always see themselves as part of the whole catchment. Certainly some people do when they've, land care, and a lot of volunteer organisations have been amazing in the work that they've done on trying to repair that riparian zone and work with landholders as well. But, people vote often in councils, not necessarily voting across the catchment. So there's all sorts of difficulties in trying to make those sorts of changes. The consultation that I was talking about that we were invited to yesterday by NEMA is trying to look at a whole of catchment model, but they're basically looking at engineering solutions and then thinking, okay, if we raise the levy in Lismore, we put that into the model, what impact is that going to have further downstream? Kind of already know that it has an impact. And there were nothing in there about nature-based solutions, which has been widely promoted by lots of different groups.
Yeah. I have an interesting question now that's come through, more about the personality, I guess, of the river. So someone's commenting about how they love hearing about the historical understanding of the river and how this can and should be taken into consideration in trying to shape a better future for everybody who lives in that area, and obviously has had profound impacts by the river's behaviour. After all of the changes you've described, the Richmond has a reputation as a wild and dangerous river. At what point in its journey does it acquire this power? And are the headwaters, which you've talked about briefly today, are they more consistent, even gentle, in contrast?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely kind of starts sort of smaller and slower and is more gentle. And then, some of it is also under the Mount Lindsay Highway now, so we don't necessarily see all of those. But the land itself is kind of more undulating. I'm not sure about the idea about how wild it is. I mean, I think that people often associate the power of it with the flooding, that happens. One of the things I think in terms of the personality of the river, one of the ways of looking at it is also that it's very sick. It's one of the most degraded rivers in New South Wales. It constantly has, poor ratings in terms of oxygen and species and fish and so on. So I guess that's how I've looked at it. Sometimes I think about wild as being something that's kind of untamed and so on. And, one of the problems for all of us is that it's been too tamed and squashed into areas and changed, and swamps drained and floodgates put into places and so on.
Someone's talking about the role that historians play in helping us to learn from our mistakes. And there's another question coming in that sort of is the other side of that, that historians have always been documenting in many respects, the problems and their causes, and then sort of by extension clearly indicating, well, here are some solutions, as unpalatable or as potentially difficult as they might be. So are historians in your area collaborating with scientists who are sometimes taken in public discourse a little bit more seriously because it's a more overt cause and effect and a solution? And how multidisciplinary is the conversation in the area at the moment about flood mitigation?
I think that, it's one of the challenges and also one of the great potentials of being in a regional university where in fact there's no history department.
It's just you.
Yeah, the DVC is also a historian, and we also have some adjunct staff who are very active in publishing and so on, and who write about the river as well. So a lot of the work, has been multidisciplinary. I've just written an article with Mandy Bruchette, Bruchette, who is a marine scientist, and Caroline Sullivan, who's an environmental economist. So, I think we do tend to work together. A lot of scientists will probably say that they're not necessarily taken seriously as well. But I do think that, you know, historians have been working on this for a long time, but climate change or the impact of, extreme weather events is often considered to be a scientific issue and not necessarily a cultural one. And I think we need to kind of expand that understanding a little bit, because we might understand the science and there may be historical records, but how do we communicate those things to enact change? And what are the things that are kind of holding us back that we can see in some of those records that exposed the issues really a long time ago?
Someone's just made the comment that it's great to hear you're working with people who understand the economy in all of its flawed details, perhaps, because I'm imagining that a lot of these decisions come down to, well, this is the most cost-effective solution now, without actually looking at the long-term, not just the raw fiscal costs, but the emotional cost, the toll that it must be taking on people who, as you said in your introduction this morning, are still actually in recovery from something that happened 3 years ago that sadly probably much of the country has moved on from, but you are still living every day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there is kind of part of me which really just believes in that idea of letting floodplains be floodplains, at one level, and in terms of the environment. Floods are great. They bring seeds and alluvial soil and, fertility and so on. And, they're a natural part of the system and not really just an event that kind of happens. But on the other hand, there is some kind of, idea that people can be protected from those things as well. So yeah, whether people are staying or, we're still in the process of the New South Wales government buying back houses to move off the floodplain, and what that will look like, in the next sort of 10 years, and those communities that have been there for a really long time. There's not a master plan at the moment for understanding what North Lismore, for example, is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
And
getting down to the river is a really good thing. And the sources, there's so much research that Southern Cross has done, just going back to that earlier question. But trying to make that kind of accessible to people, I guess, is part of the project of the open access repository.
And is that your immediate priority now? Is there something else that you're working on from this fellowship?
Well, there is I am working on that much larger project. It took a little while to get started thinking about how I was going to organise it. So I think I suggested that the library's collection is really diverse. And I've looked at a lot of other river histories as well. It would be possible to kind of look at it chronologically, from millions of years ago and the formation, I guess, of the mountains and how that works. But yeah, I want to. So what I'm doing at the moment is kind of writing along the river to kind of put emphasis on some of the different sorts of themes that come up. So I don't have to tell the same story all the time. And, that story becomes Rouse, cedar getting dairy, new settlers and hippies. And so, I think that's the kind of association, but moving away from that a little bit, I think.
Well, it's great research. You've certainly made fabulous use of many different collections here at the library. It was wonderful to have you as a fellow. So hopefully we'll see you in the reading room again soon. That, unfortunately, is all we have time for. Please join us next time. We will have our David Scott Mitchell Fellow from 2024 presenting, Dr. Nicholas Hall, and he is going to take us back to the 16th of September 1975, when Papua New Guinea gained its independence from Australia. So he focused his research on a magazine titled The Pacific Islands Monthly, and how the editorial work of Stuart Inder in founding that magazine and being a journalist shaped a lot of Australia's understanding of the Pacific. And he's going to take us back to that very specific point in time where Stuart Inder was in PNG to report on independence. So that's Tuesday, the 2nd of September at 11 o'clock, and it's on the library's website now, so you can book it and lock it into your diaries and come back in a month. Until then, there's lots of stuff happening on site and online at the library, so I hope to see you soon. Otherwise, stay curious, everyone, and thank you for coming. Bye.